The crack of thunder shook the mountain so violently that Flynn Vance nearly dropped the axe he was sharpening. And when he stepped outside his cabin to survey the storm rolling across the Wyoming peaks, he knew this one would be different from all the others. The year was 1876, and Flynn had been living alone in these mountains above Alpine for nearly 3 years now, content with his solitude and the company of the wilderness. But tonight, something pulled at him, an instinct he could not name. The wind howled through the pines like a living thing, bending the massive trees as though they were nothing more than grass. Rain came down in sheets, so thick Flynn could barely see 10 feet in front of him. He had secured his horses in the barn earlier, stocked enough wood by the fireplace to last the night, and prepared himself for the long hours ahead. These spring storms in the Tetons could last for days, turning the mountain passes into rivers and isolating his cabin from the rest of the world. Flynn stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, his broad shoulders and muscled arms the result of years spent chopping wood, hunting, and surviving in one of the harshest environments a man could choose. His dark hair fell past his shoulders, usually tied back with a leather cord, and his beard was thick, but well kept. At 28 years old, he had chosen this life deliberately, walking away from a painful past in Missouri that he rarely allowed himself to remember. He was about to head back inside when something made him pause. A sound, perhaps, or maybe just that same strange feeling that had been nagging at him all evening. Instead of returning to the warmth of his cabin, Flynn grabbed his heavy coat and pulled it on, then lit a lantern and headed toward his woodshed. The structure sat about 50 yards from the main cabin, built sturdy and strong to protect his winter stores of firewood. As Flynn approached, fighting against the wind that threatened to tear the lantern from his hand, he noticed the door was slightly ajar. He always kept it latched. Always. His hand instinctively went to the knife at his belt as he pushed the door open wider, raising the lantern to peer inside. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Curled up in the corner of the woodshed, soaked to the bone and shivering violently, was a young woman. She had pulled some of the canvas tarps over herself in a desperate attempt to stay warm, but her lips were tinged blue, and her teeth chattered so hard he could hear them over the storm. Her long dark hair was plastered to her face, and even in the dim light, Flynn could see that she was in bad shape. He knelt beside her, setting the lantern down carefully. Miss, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glazed with cold and exhaustion. She tried to speak, but only a weak sound came out. Flynn did not hesitate. He scooped her up in his arms, startled by how light she was, how fragile she felt against his chest. She barely stirred as he carried her through the storm back to his cabin, kicking the door shut behind him once they were inside. The fire was still burning strong in the hearth, casting warm light and heat throughout the single-room cabin. Flynn carried the woman to his bed, the only bed in the place, and laid her down gently. She was conscious enough to curl into herself, still shivering uncontrollably. "We need to get you out of these wet clothes," Flynn said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "You will freeze to death otherwise." He moved quickly, gathering every blanket he owned and stoking the fire even higher. Then he turned back to her, wondering how to handle this situation with some measure of propriety. But propriety seemed less important than survival right now. "Miss, I am going to help you. I will not hurt you, you understand, but these clothes have to come off." She managed a small nod, her eyes meeting his briefly. They were brown, he noticed, a deep warm brown that reminded him of the earth after rain. Flynn worked as quickly and respectfully as he could, peeling off her soaked dress, her undergarments, averting his eyes as much as possible while still getting the job done. Her skin was like ice beneath his fingers. Once she was free of the wet clothing, he wrapped her in the warmest blankets he had, then added his own heavy bearskin over top of everything. "I will make you something hot to drink," he said, moving to the stove where he always kept a pot of coffee warming. He poured some into a tin cup, then added a generous splash of whiskey from his stores. "This will help warm you from the inside." He helped her sit up enough to drink, holding the cup to her lips. She sipped slowly at first, then more eagerly, the warmth of the liquid clearly providing some relief. Some color was starting to return to her face, though she still looked half dead from exposure. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse and barely audible. "No need for thanks yet. Save your strength." Flynn set the cup aside and studied her face more carefully now that she was not in immediate danger of dying. She was younger than him, probably in her early 20s, with delicate features and long lashes. Even bedraggled and half-frozen, there was a beauty to her that struck him somewhere deep in his chest. "What is your name?" he asked. "Margot," she said softly. "Margot Miller. Flynn Vance. This is my cabin. You are safe here." Tears suddenly welled up in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks. "I am so sorry. I did not mean to trespass. I just needed shelter from the storm, and I saw the woodshed, and I thought just for a little while until it passed. But then I was so cold and I could not move, and I thought I was going to die out there." "Easy now," Flynn said, his voice gentler than he knew it could be. "You are alive. That is what matters. Rest now. We can talk more in the morning." But Margot reached out from beneath the blankets, her hand finding his arm. "You gave me your bed. Where will you sleep?" "I have a chair by the fire. I have slept in worse places, believe me." "I cannot take your bed. You have already done so much." Flynn shook his head firmly. "You need the warmth more than I do. Now please rest. Doctor's orders. You are a doctor." "No, but I have kept myself alive in these mountains for 3 years. That counts for something." A small smile touched her lips, the first real expression he had seen from her. Then her eyes drifted closed, exhaustion claiming her. Flynn stood and watched her for a moment, making sure her breathing was steady and her color continued to improve. Satisfied that she would make it through the night, he pulled one of the wooden chairs closer to the fire and settled in for a long vigil. The storm raged on outside, wind howling around the cabin and rain hammering against the roof. But inside, the fire crackled warmly and the woman in his bed slept peacefully. Flynn found himself unable to look away from her for long, wondering who she was and what circumstances had brought her to his woodshed in the middle of a mountain storm. He knew come morning there would be questions to answer and decisions to make. But for now, he simply sat and kept watch, this unexpected visitor having changed something in his solitary existence that he could not quite name yet. When dawn finally broke, the storm had lessened to a steady rain. Flynn had dozed off and on throughout the night, but mostly he had stayed awake, tending the fire and occasionally checking on Margot to make sure she was still breathing well. As pale light filtered through the cabin's single window, she stirred and opened her eyes. For a moment she looked confused, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. Then her gaze found Flynn sitting by the fire, and memory seemed to return. She pushed herself up to sitting, keeping the blankets pulled tight around her. "Good morning," Flynn said, standing and stretching his stiff muscles. "How are you feeling?" "Warmer," Margot said. "Much warmer and very embarrassed." "No need for that." "Are you hungry?" "Starving, actually." Flynn moved to the stove and began preparing breakfast. He had bacon and eggs and bread that he had baked 2 days ago. It was simple fare, but he was a competent cook after years of feeding himself. As he worked, he could feel Margot watching him. "Your clothes are hanging by the fire," he said, nodding toward where he had draped her dress and undergarments over a drying rack. "They should be mostly dry by now. I can step outside while you dress, give you some privacy." "Thank you," Margot said softly. "You are very kind. Just decent. Any man would have done the same." "I am not so sure about that." Flynn plated up the food and brought it to her, setting it on the small table beside the bed. Then he grabbed his coat and headed for the door. "I will be outside. Take your time." The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the air smelled clean and fresh the way it always did after a storm. Flynn walked to the woodshed and examined the area where he had found Margot. Her footprints were washed away by the rain, and there was no sign of how she had arrived. No horse, no wagon, nothing. She must have been on foot. When he returned to the cabin, Margot was dressed and sitting at the table, eating the breakfast he had prepared with obvious appreciation. Her hair was still damp, but she had combed it with her fingers and it fell in dark waves around her shoulders. In the morning light, Flynn could see that his first impression had been correct. She was beautiful. "This is delicious," she said. "I cannot remember the last time I had a proper meal." Flynn poured himself some coffee and sat down across from her. "You want to tell me what you were doing out in that storm? Alpine is a good 10 miles from here down the mountain." Margot set down her fork and folded her hands in her lap. He could see her gathering her courage to speak. "I was running away." "From what?" "From whom is more accurate. My stepfather." She looked up at him, and he saw both fear and defiance in her eyes. "He wanted to marry me off to a man 3 times my age, a business associate of his who needed a wife and did not care that I was unwilling. So I left. I took what money I had saved and bought a train ticket as far as it would take me. That turned out to be Rock Springs. From there, I worked odd jobs, moving from town to town, trying to get as far away as possible." "How did you end up here?" "I was working as a seamstress in Alpine for a few weeks. Saved up enough money to buy passage on a wagon heading north. But the driver—" She paused, her hands tightening. "He got ideas about payment beyond what I had agreed to. When I refused, he threw me out of the wagon in the middle of nowhere. That was yesterday morning. I walked for hours trying to find help or shelter. Then the storm came and I was lost and freezing and I saw your woodshed. I am so sorry for trespassing." Flynn felt anger rising in his chest at the thought of some wagon driver abandoning her like that. "You have nothing to apologize for. I am glad you found shelter, but you could have died out there." "I know," Margot said quietly. "I thought I would, and then you found me." They sat in silence for a moment, Flynn processing everything she had told him. She was alone in the world, running from a stepfather who sounded like a cruel man, with no resources and nowhere to go. The decent thing would be to help her get back to Alpine, maybe help her find work again or passage to somewhere safer. But even as he thought it, another voice in his head was saying something different. "How old are you?" Flynn asked. 22. "And before you ask, yes, I am old enough to make my own decisions about who I marry. But my stepfather has legal guardianship until I turn 25, since my mother died when I was 19. He uses that to control me. That is a hard situation. It was. But I am free of it now, even if it means I have nothing." Flynn stood and poured himself more coffee, thinking. "You can stay here for a few days if you need to. Rest up, get your strength back. The trails will be muddy from the storm anyway, not safe to travel for a while." Margot looked up at him with surprise. "You would let me stay?" "I am not going to send you back out there to fend for yourself. Stay until you are ready to move on, until we can figure out a better plan than you wandering around the mountains alone." "I do not know what to say." "Say you will eat the rest of that breakfast before it gets cold." A smile broke across her face, genuine and warm, and Flynn felt something shift in his chest. He turned away. busying himself with cleaning up the cooking area, suddenly very aware of how small his cabin was, and how the presence of this woman was already changing the space he had considered only his for so long. Over the next few days, an easy routine developed between them. Flynn would not hear of Margot sleeping anywhere but in his bed, despite her protests, so he continued to spend his nights in the chair by the fire. During the days, he went about his usual work of hunting, checking his trap lines and maintaining the cabin and its surroundings. Margot insisted on helping however she could, and he found her to be both resourceful and hardworking. She cooked meals that were far better than anything Flynn had made for himself in years, using the same simple ingredients, but somehow transforming them into something special. She mended his clothes, which had been in desperate need of attention. She organized his supplies and cleaned the cabin until it shone. Flynn protested at first, telling her she was a guest and did not need to work, but Margot was firm. "You saved my life," she told him. "The least I can do is make myself useful." But it was more than that, and they both knew it. The work gave them excuses to be near each other, to talk, to learn about one another. Flynn found himself telling her things he had not spoken about in years. About his childhood in Missouri, about the farm his family had owned, about his parents who had died of fever when he was 23 and his younger sister who had married and moved to California. "Why did you come here?" Margot asked one evening as they sat by the fire after supper. "To these mountains, I mean. It seems like such a solitary life." Flynn was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "After my parents died, I stayed on the farm for a couple years, tried to keep it going, but everywhere I looked I saw memories. Every corner of that house reminded me of what I had lost. I needed a fresh start, somewhere completely different. A friend told me about the Tettons, about how wild and beautiful they were. So I sold the farm, packed what I could carry, and headed west." "Do you ever regret it?" "Not until recently," he said, then realized what he had admitted. He looked at her and found her watching him with those deep brown eyes. "I mean, the solitude was what I wanted, but now—" "Now," Margot prompted softly, "now I am remembering what it is like to have someone to talk to. Someone to share meals with. It is nice." "It is," she agreed, and there was something in her voice that made Flynn's heart beat faster. He stood abruptly, needing to put some distance between them before he said or did something foolish. "It is getting late. You should get some rest." Margot stood as well, but instead of moving toward the bed, she stepped closer to him. "Flynn, I cannot keep taking your bed. We could share it. I trust you. And you cannot be comfortable sleeping in that chair every night." Everything in Flynn wanted to say yes. But he knew what could happen if they shared a bed, knew the temptation would be too great. That would not be proper. "Proper," Margot repeated, a slight edge to her voice. "I ran away from propriety. I chose freedom over what was proper. I am not asking you to compromise me, Flynn. I am just asking you to get a decent night's sleep in your own bed. Margot, please, let me do this one thing for you." Against his better judgment, Flynn found himself agreeing. That night they lay on opposite sides of the bed, a careful distance between them. Flynn was acutely aware of every breath she took, every small movement she made. He thought he would never fall asleep, but the exhaustion of days spent in the chair finally claimed him, and he drifted off to the sound of rain beginning to fall again on the roof. He woke in the middle of the night to find Margot had unconsciously moved closer in her sleep, seeking warmth. Her head was tucked against his shoulder, one arm draped across his chest. Flynn knew he should move away, should put proper distance between them again. But she fit against him so perfectly, and the feel of her there made something in his chest ache with longing. Carefully, he put his arm around her, telling himself he was just making sure she stayed warm. Margot sighed in her sleep and settled even closer. Flynn lay awake for a long time after that, listening to the rain and holding this woman who had stumbled into his life just a few days ago, but already felt essential to it. Morning brought clarity and confusion in equal measure. They woke tangled together, and Margot pulled away with a blush, mumbling apologies. Flynn assured her it was fine, that they had just been sleeping, nothing improper had happened. But the air between them felt charged now, full of possibility and danger. A week passed, then two. The weather improved, turning warm and pleasant as spring truly settled into the mountains. The trails dried out and would have been safe for travel, but neither Flynn nor Margot mentioned her leaving. Instead, they fell into a deeper routine, one that felt less like host and guest and more like partners. Flynn taught Margot to fish in the stream that ran near his property, laughing at her delight when she caught her first trout. Margot showed Flynn how to make proper bread, the kind his mother used to make, but that he had never quite mastered. They took long walks through the forest, and Flynn pointed out the different plants and animals, sharing the knowledge he had accumulated over 3 years of mountain living. They talked for hours each night, sharing stories and dreams and fears. Flynn learned that Margot had always wanted to be a teacher, that she loved books and learning. Margot learned that Flynn had a dry sense of humor beneath his gruff exterior, that he could identify 100 different bird songs, that he whittled small wooden animals when he could not sleep. And through it all, the attraction between them grew stronger, an undercurrent to everything they did. Flynn found himself watching the way the sunlight caught in Margot's hair, the way she bit her lower lip when she was concentrating on a task. Margot noticed the strength in Flynn's hands, the gentleness in his touch when he helped her over a fallen log on their walks, the way his eyes softened when he looked at her. They continued to share the bed each night, and they continued to wake in each other's arms each morning. But they did not speak of it, both afraid of what acknowledging it might mean. The breaking point came on a warm afternoon in late May. Flynn had been chopping wood, and he came inside shirtless and sweating to find Margot reading one of his few books by the window. She looked up when he entered, and her eyes went wide at the sight of him. He saw her gaze travel across his chest, his shoulders, his arms, taking in the full extent of the muscles he had built through years of hard labor. "Sorry," he said, suddenly self-conscious. "I should have cleaned up before coming inside." Margot set down the book and stood, walking toward him slowly. "Flynn, we need to talk." His heart started pounding. "About what? About this? About us? About what is happening here?" "Nothing is happening," Flynn said, but it was a weak protest and they both knew it. "Something is happening," Margot insisted. "It has been happening since the night you found me. Maybe even since the moment I woke up and saw you sitting by the fire watching over me, and I think you feel it too." Flynn wanted to deny it, wanted to protect them both from the complications this could bring, but he was tired of denying what his heart had been shouting at him for weeks now. "Yes," he said simply, "I feel it." Margot reached up and placed her hand against his chest, right over his heart. "What are we going to do about it? I do not know. You are young, you have your whole life ahead of you. I am just a mountain man living in isolation. You deserve better than this, better than me." "You do not get to decide what I deserve," Margot said, her voice fierce. "I am the one who gets to decide that. And I have decided that what I want, what I deserve, is to be with someone who is kind and good and who makes me feel safe and valued. Someone who looks at me like I matter, like I am more than just a burden or a commodity to be traded. Someone exactly like you." Flynn cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing across her cheeks. "Margot, if we do this, if we take this step, there is no going back. I am not a man for halfway measures. If I let myself love you, it will be completely and forever." "Then love me," she whispered. "Because I am already falling in love with you." Flynn kissed her then, a kiss that held all the longing and restraint of the past 2 weeks. Margot responded with equal passion, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressing against his. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Flynn rested his forehead against hers. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Are you absolutely sure this is what you want?" "I have never been more sure of anything in my life." Flynn swept her up into his arms, carrying her to the bed they had been sharing so chastely all this time. He laid her down gently, his eyes asking one more time if this was truly what she wanted. Margot answered by pulling him down to her, and then there were no more words, only the two of them discovering each other with a tenderness and passion that felt both new and ancient. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the afternoon light filtering through the window, Flynn's fingers tracing lazy patterns on Margot's shoulder. She was tucked against his side, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I love you," Flynn said, the words coming easier now that he had allowed himself to feel them fully. "I know it has only been a few weeks, but I love you, Margot Miller." "I love you too," Margot said, tilting her head up to kiss his jaw, "and I do not care that it has only been a few weeks. Sometimes you just know." "What do we do now?" Flynn asked. "About your stepfather, about your legal situation." Margot was quiet for a moment, thinking. "In 3 years I will be 25 and he will have no more hold over me. We could wait until then, stay hidden here in the mountains." "Or," Flynn said slowly, an idea forming, "or we could get married. Once you are married, your husband becomes your legal guardian, not your stepfather. He would have no more claim on you." Margot sat up, looking down at him with wide eyes. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I am." "I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other for a few weeks. But I also know that I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep holding you every night. I want to build a life with you here in these mountains or wherever else you want to go. So yes, Margot Miller, I am asking you to marry me." Tears spilled down Margot's cheeks, but she was smiling. "Yes, yes, Flynn Vance, I will marry you." They made the trip down to Alpine the next day, riding double on Flynn's horse since Margot had arrived on foot. The small town was bustling with activity, miners and ranchers and families all going about their business. Flynn led Margot straight to the church, where a kind-faced minister named Reverend Cooper agreed to marry them that very afternoon. They had no rings, no fancy clothes, no guests to witness the ceremony. But as they stood before the Reverend and pledged their lives to each other, Flynn felt a completeness he had never experienced before. When Reverend Cooper pronounced them man and wife and told Flynn he could kiss his bride, Flynn did so with a joy that made the Reverend chuckle. "You two have the look of people truly in love," Reverend Cooper said as he filled out their marriage certificate. "It does my heart good to see it. Will you be staying in Alpine?" "No, sir," Flynn said, his arm around Margot's waist. "We have a home up in the mountains. That is where we will be." They spent one night at the Alpine boarding house, a luxury after weeks in the cabin, and Flynn took great pleasure in signing the register as Flynn and Margot Vance. The next morning, they bought supplies to bring back to the cabin, including fabric, so Margot could make herself some proper dresses, more books for them both to read, and better cooking supplies. As they rode back up into the mountains, Margot with her arms wrapped around Flynn's waist, he felt a contentment settle over him that he had never thought to experience again. The solitude he had sought for 3 years had been broken, but in its place was something infinitely better. He had a partner now, a wife, someone to share this wild, beautiful life with. The months that followed were some of the happiest of Flynn's life. He and Margot settled into married life with an ease that surprised them both. She transformed the cabin into a real home, adding curtains to the windows and wildflowers in jars on the table. Flynn built her a bookshelf and made regular trips to Alpine to trade his furs and meat for books, returning each time with treasures for his wife. They worked together on everything. Margot learned to hunt, and Flynn learned to appreciate the quiet moments of reading together by the fire. They expanded the garden, putting in vegetables and herbs. Flynn built an addition onto the cabin, creating a separate bedroom and a larger living area. Margot proved to be an excellent shot with a rifle, bringing down her first deer in September and whooping with joy at her success. When winter came, bringing deep snow and bitter cold, they were ready. They had enough supplies to last months without needing to leave the cabin, and they spent the long dark evenings talking, reading, making love, and dreaming about the future. Margot told Flynn she wanted children someday, and Flynn admitted he had always wanted to be a father. They planned and hoped and built a life together in words before they would build it in reality. Spring came again, and with it, a surprise. Margot woke one morning feeling ill, and after a few days of the same, they both realized what it meant. She was pregnant. Flynn could barely contain his joy, swinging her around carefully despite her protests that he would make her dizzy. "We are going to have a baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "We are going to be parents." "You are going to be such a good father," Margot said, her hands on his face. "Our child is so lucky." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Flynn was attentive to Margot's every need. He made sure she ate well, rested often, and never overtaxed herself. As her belly grew, he would talk to the baby, telling stories about the mountains and promising to teach their child everything he knew about this wild, beautiful place. In late October, as the aspens were turning gold and the first snows were threatening, Margot went into labor. Flynn had arranged for a midwife from Alpine to come stay with them as the due date approached, and the older woman proved invaluable as she guided Margot through the long hours of labor. Flynn held Margot's hand the entire time, murmuring encouragement and wiping the sweat from her brow. When their son finally arrived, squalling and healthy and perfect, Flynn had tears streaming down his face. Margot was crying too as the midwife placed the baby in her arms. "He is beautiful," Flynn said, his voice choked with emotion. "He is absolutely perfect. What should we name him?" Margot asked, looking up at her husband with exhausted but joyful eyes. Flynn thought for a moment. "What about Samuel? That was my father's name." "Samuel Vance," Margot said, testing the name. "It is perfect. Hello, Samuel. Welcome to the world, little one." Flynn knelt beside the bed, one arm around his wife and one finger held in the tiny fist of his newborn son, and felt a love so profound it almost frightened him with its intensity. This was his family. This was everything he had never known he needed. The years that followed were full and rich. Samuel grew into a strong, healthy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's brown eyes. Flynn taught him to fish and track and identify plants, just as he had once taught Margot. Margot taught him to read and write, determined that their son would be educated even though they lived far from any schoolhouse. When Samuel was 3, Margot gave birth to a daughter they named Grace. 2 years after that came another boy, James. The cabin had to be expanded again to accommodate their growing family, and Flynn built on a second story with bedrooms for the children. Life was not always easy. There were hard winters and lean times, illnesses and accidents, and the countless challenges that came with raising children in such a remote location. But there was also laughter and love, and a deep satisfaction in the life they had built together. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Flynn and Margot stood on the porch of their cabin watching their 3 children play in the yard. Samuel, now 9, was teaching 6-year-old Grace how to skip stones in the stream while 4-year-old James tried to catch frogs. "Do you ever think about that storm?" Margot asked, leaning against her husband. "The night I ended up in your woodshed." Flynn put his arm around her, pulling her close. "All the time, best storm of my life. Mine too, though I thought I was going to die." "I am very glad you did not," Flynn said, kissing the top of her head. "I cannot imagine my life without you in it." Margot looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw all the love and partnership and joy of the past 10 years. "I was running away that night. Running from a life I did not want, toward a future I could not even imagine, and I ended up finding everything I had ever dreamed of and more." "Same here," Flynn said. "I thought I wanted solitude. Turns out what I really wanted was you." Samuel called out then, asking his father to come see the fish he had spotted in the stream. Flynn kissed Margot once more and then jogged down to join his children. Margot watched from the porch, her hand resting on her belly where another baby was just beginning to grow, though she had not told Flynn yet. She would tell him tonight, she decided, and they would celebrate this new blessing together. As the sun set over the Teton Peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold, Margot felt a profound gratitude for the twists of fate that had brought her to this place. A desperate flight from an unwanted marriage had led her to a woodshed in a storm, which had led her to a man who had given her his bed that first night and his heart soon after. She had been looking for freedom when she ran away, but she had found something so much better. She had found home. She had found love. She had found Flynn. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and challenges. The fourth baby, a girl named Rose, was born the following spring. Flynn and Margot's children grew strong and capable, learning the ways of the mountains while also receiving the education Margot insisted upon. She had sent away for books and taught all 4 children their letters and numbers, history and science and literature. Samuel, as the eldest, took on more and more responsibility as he grew into his teenage years. He had his father's build, growing tall and broad-shouldered, and Flynn relied on him more and more to help with the hunting and trapping. But the boy also had a gentle soul like his mother, and could often be found reading to his younger siblings by the fire. Grace proved to be the most adventurous of the children, always wanting to explore farther into the wilderness, always asking questions about everything she saw. Flynn had to keep a close eye on her to make sure her curiosity did not lead her into danger, but he secretly loved her fearless spirit. James was the quiet one, thoughtful and observant. He loved to help his mother in the garden and had a gift for growing things. By the time he was 8, he had expanded their vegetable patch significantly and was experimenting with different crops to see what would thrive in the mountain climate. Rose, the baby, was only 4 years old but already showing signs of having inherited both her parents' stubbornness and determination. She followed Grace everywhere, trying to keep up with her older sister despite her shorter legs. Flynn and Margot watched their children grow with pride and amazement. On quiet evenings after the children were in bed, they would sit together on the porch and talk about the future, making plans and dreams just as they had in those early days of their marriage. "Samuel will be 17 next year," Margot said one evening. "Old enough to go to a real school if he wanted to. We should at least offer him the choice." Flynn was quiet for a moment, smoking his pipe and considering. "You are right. All of them should have that choice when they are old enough. We cannot keep them up here forever, no matter how much I might want to. You would miss them terribly if they left. Of course I would, but they need to make their own way in the world just like we did. We can give them the skills and education they need, but ultimately they have to choose their own paths." Margot reached over and took Flynn's hand. "You are a good father." "I learned from the best," Flynn said, squeezing her hand. "My own father before he died. He always said that the measure of a man was not in what he achieved for himself, but in what he built for those who came after him. I think about that a lot when I look at our children. This life we have built, this home, these skills we have taught them, this is what we are leaving behind. This is what matters." As it turned out, Samuel did not want to leave the mountains. When Flynn broached the subject of sending him to school in a larger town, the boy was adamant that he wanted to stay. He loved the wilderness, loved the life they had built. What he wanted, he told his parents, was to eventually have his own cabin nearby, to raise his own family in these mountains just as his parents had raised him. Flynn felt a swell of pride at his son's words, though he made sure to tell Samuel that if he ever changed his mind, the offer would always stand. The years brought changes to Alpine and the surrounding areas. The mining boom that had drawn so many to Wyoming was fading, but ranching was on the rise. The little town grew and developed, getting a proper school and a general store that carried an impressive array of goods. Flynn made the trip down more frequently now, often bringing one or more of the children with him so they could experience the wider world beyond their mountain home. On one such trip, when Samuel was 19 and Grace 16, they encountered a problem Flynn had hoped to avoid. A man in the general store recognized Margot's description from an old wanted notice that had been circulating years ago. Her stepfather, it seemed, had posted a reward for information about her whereabouts, claiming she had stolen from him when she ran away. The man confronted them directly, asking Margot if she was the woman from the notice. Before Flynn could intervene, Margot stepped forward, her head held high. "I am Margot Vance," she said clearly. "I was born Margot Miller, yes. But I did not steal anything from my stepfather except my own freedom. I left to escape a forced marriage, and I have been happily married to my husband for 15 years. If my stepfather wants to make trouble about it, he can try, but I am not the scared girl I was back then." The man looked taken aback by her confidence. Flynn stepped up beside his wife, his considerable presence making his position clear. "My wife has committed no crimes," he said, his voice calm but with an edge of steel. "She is a respectable married woman with 4 children. If there is a problem, we can discuss it with the sheriff." The sheriff, as it turned out, was a reasonable man named Tom Richards who had known Flynn for years through his trading. When they explained the situation, he listened carefully and then shook his head. "Far as I am concerned, there is no case here," Sheriff Richards said. "Mrs. Vance, you were of legal age when you left your stepfather's house, is that correct?" "I was 22, sir." "And you say he wanted to force you into a marriage you did not consent to?" "That is correct." "Then you had every right to leave. As for this allegation of theft, do you have any proof of what you took with you?" Margot thought for a moment. "I took some clothes, some personal belongings that had belonged to my mother, and about $40 that I had saved from work I did as a seamstress. All of it was rightfully mine." Sheriff Richards made some notes. "Well, I do not see any crime here. And even if your stepfather wanted to press charges, which would be mighty hard to prove after 15 years, you are under your husband's protection now. Legally, he cannot touch you." The relief Flynn felt was immense, though he had been prepared to fight if necessary to protect Margot from her stepfather's reach. They thanked the sheriff and headed back home, the incident serving as a reminder that the past was never quite as far behind them as they liked to think. But the confrontation also brought a sense of closure. Margot had faced the fear that had been lurking in the back of her mind for years, and had come through it stronger. That evening, as they told the rest of the family about what had happened, she felt lighter somehow, as though a weight she had been carrying for a long time had finally been lifted. Grace, who at 16 was becoming a formidable young woman in her own right, was indignant on her mother's behalf. "If that stepfather ever shows his face here, he will have to deal with all of us," she declared, and Samuel nodded his agreement. Flynn looked at his children, all of them ready to defend their mother, and felt his heart swell with pride. This was what they had built together, he and Margot. Not just a home or a life, but a family that stood together against whatever challenges came their way. As the children grew into young adults, Flynn and Margot found themselves with more time together, just the two of them. Samuel built his own cabin about a mile from theirs, and married a woman named Elizabeth from Alpine. They welcomed Flynn and Margot's first grandchild, a boy named Flynn after his grandfather, when Samuel was 23. Grace, true to her adventurous nature, became a schoolteacher in Alpine, teaching the children of miners and ranchers and becoming known for her innovative methods and genuine care for her students. She married a deputy sheriff named Michael when she was 21, and they built a home in town. James, who had always loved the land, became a rancher, buying property in the valley below the mountains and raising cattle. He married a rancher's daughter named Catherine, and together they built one of the most successful ranches in the area. Rose, the youngest, surprised everyone by deciding she wanted to be a doctor. It meant leaving Wyoming to attend school back east, but Flynn and Margot supported her dream, even though it meant years of her being far from home. She wrote faithfully every week, and her letters were treasured by the whole family. As Flynn and Margot grew older, they found themselves often sitting on the porch they had sat on so many times before, watching the sun set over the mountains. Their hair was gray now, their bodies not quite as strong as they once were, but their love for each other had only deepened with time. "Do you have any regrets?" Margot asked one evening. They were in their 60s now, and the question had taken on a new significance as they contemplated the years behind them. Flynn reached over and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the decades. "Not a single one. You?" "No," Margot said softly. "I was terrified that night when I took shelter in your woodshed. Terrified of the storm, terrified of what I had left behind, terrified of the unknown future. But it led me to you, and that has made everything else worthwhile. I think about what my life would have been if you had not stumbled into that woodshed," Flynn said. "I would have kept living here alone, probably until the day I died. I would have thought I was content, but I would never have known what I was missing. I would never have known this kind of happiness." Margot leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The mountains rose around them, constant and eternal, witnesses to the life they had built together. They had years yet ahead of them, years of watching their grandchildren grow, of seeing their children thrive in the lives they had chosen. Rose eventually returned from medical school and set up a practice in Alpine, becoming the first female doctor in the region. She married a fellow doctor, and they had 3 children who grew up splitting their time between the sophistication of their mother's medical practice and the wild freedom of their grandparents' mountain home. Samuel and Elizabeth had 4 more children after their first, filling their cabin with noise and laughter. Grace and Michael had 3 children who all inherited their mother's adventurous spirit and their father's sense of justice. James and Catherine had twin boys who took to ranching like they were born to it, which they essentially were. Flynn and Margot's family grew large and sprawling, encompassing not just their own descendants, but the friends and neighbors who had become like family over the years. The cabin that had once housed just Flynn alone now saw regular gatherings of 30 or more people, especially during holidays and special occasions. On their 40th wedding anniversary, all of their children and grandchildren gathered for a celebration. Samuel had arranged it all, bringing everyone together at the original cabin where Flynn and Margot still lived. Tables were set up in the yard, loaded with food. Children ran and played, their laughter echoing through the trees. 3 generations of the Vance family came together to celebrate the love that had started it all. Flynn stood and called for everyone's attention, raising his glass in a toast. 40 years ago, he said, his voice still strong despite his age, a storm brought me the greatest gift of my life. Your mother, your grandmother, showed up half frozen in my woodshed, and I brought her inside and gave her my bed. I had no idea that that simple act of decency would change everything. He looked at Margot, who was wiping tears from her eyes. I loved you from almost the first moment, though it took me a while to admit it. And I have loved you every day since, through all the joys and challenges and adventures we have shared. You made my life meaningful. You gave me this beautiful family. You turned my lonely cabin into a home. I thank God for that storm every single day. Margot stood and kissed her husband, and their family erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration went on late into the night, with music and dancing and storytelling. The older grandchildren wanted to hear again the story of how their grandparents met, and Flynn and Margot obliged, taking turns telling the tale. I thought I was going to die out there in that storm, Margot said, her hand in Flynn's. I was so cold and so scared. And then this mountain man found me and saved my life. She was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, Flynn added, even soaked and half frozen. I knew right then that my life was about to change. Did you really fall in love in just a few weeks? One of the granddaughters asked, wide-eyed and romantic. We did, Margot confirmed. Sometimes when it is right, you just know. Your grandfather asked me to marry him after only 2 weeks, and I said yes without hesitation. Best decision I ever made, Flynn said, squeezing Margot's hand. As the evening wore on and the younger children were put to bed in various corners of the cabin and the nearby homes, the adults sat around the fire sharing their own stories and memories. Samuel talked about learning to hunt with his father. Grace remembered her mother teaching her to read. James spoke of the first garden he had planted all by himself, using the skills his mother had taught him. Rose shared memories of her grandmother's stories that had first sparked her interest in healing and medicine. Flynn and Margot listened to it all, amazed by the ripple effects of their lives and their love. The decision Margot had made to run away from her stepfather, the storm that had driven her to Flynn's woodshed, the choice Flynn had made to bring her inside and care for her, all of it had led to this. To this family, these children and grandchildren, these lives that would not exist if not for that one fateful night. The years continued to pass, gentler now but still full. Flynn and Margot slowed down, spending more time sitting than working, more time remembering than planning. But they were content, surrounded by family, secure in the knowledge that they had lived well and loved deeply. Flynn passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, Margot beside him as she had been for nearly 50 years. The family gathered for the funeral, and he was buried on the mountain he had loved so much, with a view of the Teton Peaks he had called home. Margot lived another 5 years, staying in the cabin with various family members taking turns keeping her company. She spent her days reading, gardening when she was able, and holding court for her ever-growing family. Great-grandchildren came to visit, and she told them stories of the wild old days, of the mountain man who had saved her life and won her heart. When Margot died at the age of 76, she was buried beside Flynn on the mountain. Her family stood around her grave and shared memories, each one a testament to the love and strength she had brought to all their lives. Rose, now a respected doctor in her 50s, spoke at her mother's funeral. "My mother taught us that love is the most powerful force in the world," she said. "Not romantic love only, though she and my father certainly had that in abundance, but all kinds of love. The love of family, the love of the land, the love of a life well lived. She ran away from cruelty and found kindness. She ran away from control and found freedom. She ran away from a life she did not want and found everything she had ever dreamed of and more." That is her legacy to all of us. The knowledge that we can choose our own paths, that we can find love even in the most unexpected places, that we can build something beautiful out of even the hardest circumstances. The family stayed on the mountain that day long after the funeral ended, telling stories and sharing meals, celebrating the life of a woman who had started with nothing and built everything. They talked about Flynn, too, about the gentle giant of a man who had given a desperate stranger his bed and ended up giving her his whole heart. The cabin remained in the family for generations, lovingly maintained and passed down from parent to child. It became a gathering place, a reminder of where they had all come from. The story of Flynn and Margot was told and retold, becoming part of the family's foundation, a touchstone they returned to again and again. And sometimes, on stormy nights, when the wind howled through the mountains and the rain came down in sheets, the family members who stayed in the cabin would think of that first storm, the one that had changed everything. They would think of a young woman desperate and freezing, seeking shelter in a woodshed. They would think of a lonely man who made a choice to help a stranger, not knowing it would lead to a lifetime of love. The mountain stood eternal and unchanging, witness to it all. The Tettons had seen Flynn arrive alone and build his solitary life. They had seen Margot stumble into his world during that fateful storm. They had seen the family grow and flourish over the decades. And they would continue to stand, holding the memory of a love story that began with the simplest of kindnesses and grew into something extraordinary. In the end, that was what mattered most. Not the hardships they had faced or the challenges they had overcome, but the love they had shared and the family they had built. Flynn had given Margot his bed that first night, but in the nights and years that followed, they had given each other so much more. They had given each other a home, a purpose, a reason to wake up each morning with joy. They had given each other the greatest gift possible, a life filled with love. And that legacy lived on in every child, grandchild, and great-grandchild who carried their blood and their lessons forward into the future. The storm had passed long ago, but its effects rippled outward still, touching lives not yet born, shaping a future that Flynn and Margot could never have imagined when they first met. This was their story, a mountain man and the woman he found sleeping in his woodshed during a storm. It was a story of kindness and courage, of taking chances and choosing love. It was a story that proved that sometimes the worst storms in our lives bring us to exactly where we are meant to be, to exactly who we are meant to be with. And it was a story that, in the hearts and memories of their family, would live forever, as enduring as the mountains themselves, as powerful as the storm that had started it all.